crafted in Hellfire, Tween and Teen in the wilds of San Martin. Following my mother remarrying, we moved to a rural area called San Martin. We'll talk a lot more on that later. There were a few memorable experiences that stand out to me that may be worth sharing. The majority of my memories were not easy. I feel I was definitely forged in the fires of adversity. I will tell a number of stories here. Cynthia's my oldest sister. Her car broke down with its battery no longer holding a charge one time. I had purchased a car battery for my very large used 1968 Buick Electra, but I had not yet installed the battery since my current battery was still somewhat functional. It just required a weekly booster charge, which is why I bought the battery. I would replace it when it could no longer function at all. My mother had asked, though, that she would like to take my extra battery and give it to Cynthia, saying that she would pay me back when she was next paid herself. Money was short for all of us. I agreed since my car could run with the boost charging every week, and my sister's car did not run at all. It seemed reasonable. Unfortunately, I was never paid back for my battery, and I had to buy a third battery eventually for my car. I had worked a lot of time to get money to buy that battery, a very long time. It really bothered me that my mother witnessed everything happen, took my battery, never repaid for it, and never once apologized, perhaps justifiably not having enough money. She had promised to give the money for my battery and didn't seem to care or recall that she had promised to pay for the battery so that I would have the one battery when I needed it. There was another time. It was storming outside. I don't remember that much of this event. But again, I recall it was on a stormy night in San Martin that I had exited out our back door and walked near our adobe stand-up pool that was sitting on a cement slab. Thunder and lightning was everywhere, and suddenly there was a huge blast, and it actually struck the ground and concrete where the pool was, not that far from where I was. There was a single seared, burned, wide mark on the concrete where it struck. I do not know if it was my reflexes from the startle from the blast or if it was the blast itself and its energy, but I fell backward into the house after it struck. I ran into the house to tell people, but no one believed me, nor were they willing to even go look at the singe mark on the ground. I was so disheartened that my life-threatening event had not even the slightest interest from anyone at all. Later on in my childhood, in San Martin, I would help around the house and property all the time. Both that I wanted to be helpful, and it was a way to earn money. One chore that I did was maintain the electric fence. On a morning after a rainstorm, I went out with my mother to inspect every single electric fence node and juncture, especially those where tree branches could have fallen or lowered and made contact with the fence. Later, when dry, it could start a fire. My mother splayed the top and bottom electric wires apart to step through, and she did. I went to follow her, and when touching the wires, though, for me, as I spread them apart, they shocked me, unlike my mother. It arced and zapped from the wires onto my fingers. I declared, "The fence is on!" in horror. My mother said firmly, "No, it is not." She stepped back through the fence to my side. She spread the fence wires wide just as she did before to cross through. It was impossible. I was shocked by electricity, and she was not. It made no sense. So my mother showed me. I saw with my own disbelieving eyes. She stepped through again. The fence was off. I obviously was simply crazy, I guessed. I went to splay the fence open once again as she did and stepped through. Zap! Again, what the heck? My mother looked astonished and she admonished me. Stop joking and let's get going. I was not joking. It was real. It was painful. How could my mother absorb electricity when I could not? Was I insane? What was going on? I was so confused, if not outright bewildered. I swiped quickly over the fence a few times, scared, to see if I could see the sparks or arcs. And yes, arc zap! My mother even saw it. Instantly, my mother knew what was actually happening. She was wearing rubber goulashes to walk in the mud after the rain. They insulated her from the ground, and so she could not conduct electricity through her body to the ground, and so she was completely immune to it. I, on the other hand, was wearing wet sneakers, which conducted electricity very well. Electricity went from my hand, through my body, to my shoes, and to the earth. That completed an electrical circuit, and so I was zapped, whereas her goulashes prevented her completing the circuit to the earth, and so she was not zapped. She marched back to the garage where the electric fence generator was, and sure enough, it glowed red on. My mother apologized profusely. I learned after being electrocuted repeatedly, following my mother's directions and assurances. I learned painfully that day to not trust my mother or anyone blindly ever again. The best intentions are based on knowledge, which even a good person may not in fact know. Therefore, I concluded that all people, good or evil, cannot be trusted completely. All things are like Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had said during the Cold War, trust but verify. That was a harsh lesson as a young kid. You know, in another time in San Martin, my parents were building a hay barn in the back where I was helping out. Unfortunately, a 2x4 crossbeam slipped and it fell directly onto my head. I was knocked out cold, with blood flowing from my head where the skin had split open across my skull. My mother had no insurance of merit at that time. So she took me inside and told me that if it got really bad, we would go to the doctor. Well, we never left the home, and I just healed over time. I don't remember much about it at all. I have often wondered if my brain suffered some kind of damage with a gigantic beam falling 10 feet onto a little kid's head and causing bleeding and potentially a cracked skull. I really don't know. I had to hold the skin together with bandages with the hair. I imagine I must have had a concussion. It took over a week until I could even function without any pain in my head, much less outside of my head. And the blood was just gross that came out and dried onto my hair and bandages. It simply wasn't possible to bandage and keep it there with all the hair everywhere. You know, pain, it's a great teacher. I learned not to trust my mother or anyone to have control over my environment that day. Everything about my well-being is in my hands and no one else's hands. I could only conclude that my life and my safety was my responsibility and mine alone to manage. Even with that knowledge, some months later, I observed ants had been invading us in the area. They were huge ants, almost 1/2 to 3/4 inch long each, and quite large. Rarely there would be an inch full long ant, and their bites stung. I had a model airplane with fuel at a friend's house, and I thought, hey, this stuff could flow down the ant holes and fill everything up. We could ignite it and they'd be all gone, literally in a puff of smoke. My burn the anthill idea may have worked were it not for unintended consequences. Upon lighting the hole and seeing it do exactly as I had envisioned, the flames followed the fumes up into the air like a sorcerer's fire and then down into the can of fuel I held. Uh-oh. My friend screamed and I looked down into the can, which erupted like a flamethrower, with all of its contents bursting out the only way it could. Up into my face. A flame. Burn, burn, I was burning. My friend pounded on the flames all over my face, but my face burned. Oils burned. My sister Cynthia happened to be riding by on her horse. Lightning. Right then, and jumped off the horse and grabbed the garden hose from my friend's house to further cool my burns as they began to slowly burn out on themselves with no more fuel to burn. I suffered 2nd and 3rd degree burns. I have scars to show for it to this day. The doctors say my healing bordered miraculously, though. I did not follow directions well for healing either. Within a week of wearing those bandages that they had given me, and sitting there doing nothing, I found I was able to put on my motorcycle helmet over the bandages and ride outside free of the house. Neighbors and friends thought I was utterly crazy, but I was happier. I was free. My mother managed to secure a moonlight job from her full-time employer, Shugart, one time, over the summer. Shugart made floppy disk drives and hard disk drives for computers. Shugart needed a small add-on electronic board for their disk drives. They needed them assembled. They had to be assembled by hand, and so they needed an individual electronic components that were adjusted and aligned and inserted and soldered onto these little crescent-shaped boards by a person. My mother agreed to be that person. She gave us kids the chance to do the work and earn a piece of the action. Earn some money for ourselves. While, of course, we earn money for her. And it could be a lot of money, especially for a kid. My sisters failed to do sufficiently the quality that was required for Shugart, so they were fired. My friend, Jeff Lefferts, and I were spectacular at making the boards. And our finished boards virtually always passed the test harness, which was used to verify that all the components were integrated and working on the board as expected. We were great, and our work showed it. I learned a lot about electronic components and a lot more out of the curiosity that prompted by doing that work. I was inspired to know more about how things were, how they worked, and how the things we were building used all those components. I expanded my learning to include disk drives themselves. That's where I learned about stepper motors, resistors, capacitors, variable and constant angular velocity, data read rates due to positioning on a rotating disk, because there's more surface area at the outer rim than the inner rim of a disk. All sorts of stuff. Jeff Lefferts and I played word games while we worked, covertly assembling the electronic boards for my mother for Shugart, behind the veil of my mother. Of course, it was a deception on her part for concealing that she was in fact having child labor. Either way, I was glad to be earning money. We would open a dictionary, Jeff and I, or a thesaurus, and choose pages and words at random to learn. We'd find a word, a synonym, antonym, and use them in variations in sentences, albeit insane sentences which might be arguably effed up imagination ideas. And then there were the word association games where we had to come up with something like the last stated word. And we had alliteration games where you had to rhyme or have an alliterative word or phrase following the other person's word or phrase. My vocabulary and storytelling and ability to construct complex sentences and narratives was greatly enhanced through our word games while we worked making Shugart boards. Perhaps the only negative there was that we did not know how to pronounce the words that we had learned from the dictionary. I think my most egregious mispronunciation that I was called out on was awry. I pronounced it awry versus awry. Of course, once corrected, I tried to use the proper pronunciation forevermore. My life has been a lot like Slumdog Millionaire the movie, with so many random events granting unique knowledge to me that most people would simply never have been exposed to. And my near photographic memory and spy-like situational awareness and word recall made everything I learned instantly available to my mind in any situation, seemingly without pause or any difficulty. I was able to recall and leverage and apply everything. People around me would say that I must be a Jedi Master, though some would joke I was a Sith Lord, if they didn't appreciate my style or my methods. But regardless, I had a superpower. Of course, now that extraordinary Richard is no longer on the planet. His body has declined. His mind has and continues to degenerate. He cannot do what he once did. Looking into the mirror, I do not recognize my face. I remember a different me. And the man in the mirror is not that man. It is not me. Physically or psychologically or cognitively. Even my teeth do not look like my teeth. Did they twist and chip when I did not notice, or have I forgotten how they got that way? In many ways, as a protection tool, I believe, I sometimes treat myself in the third person, I've observed. It distances me from the nightmare that seems to be enveloping my very existence. And certainly is stealing my mind's prowess and my memories. Richard has become a third person at times to me. And most of the time, I do not recognize this Richard. Early on in life, I had heard that Benjamin Franklin held a belief that things will generally go wrong unless you work diligently to change it into a positive outcome. I adopted the Benjamin Franklin philosophy and described it to people as this, that I was a pessimistic optimist. As a pessimist, I expected the worst. As an optimist, I believed that I could make things succeed. Ergo, I was and am a pessimistic optimist. It may be easy and natural to judge my childhood as harsh and unforgiving, and that is quite possibly true. But it is also possible that the incendiary challenges and hardships of my hell difficulty life have forged me in its hellfires to be stronger and able to triumph over the adversities that I would yet face in my young adult and mature life. That is what I choose to believe, that my hardships were ultimately for my benefit. They helped me grow into a stronger, wiser, more capable, insightful, and compassionate leader. Indeed, I was crafted in hellfire.